Have you ever looked in the mirror and thought, wow, humanity really peaked when it invented this shiny thing just so I could fix my hair? Because that's what most of us think, that mirrors were designed for people to fix their hair, check their teeth, and occasionally throw motivational speeches at themselves. But what if I told you that's not even close? 4,000 years before your foggy bathroom mirror existed, ancient civilizations in Mesoamerica, like Olmecs, who were already crafting pitch-black obsidian mirrors, but they didn't use them to straighten their bangs. Oh no, these were tools for priests and shamans, ritual portals meant to summon spirits, peer into other worlds, and maybe even catch a glimpse of the future. And you thought your bathroom mirror was scary at 6 in the morning. Try staring into one and accidentally summoning a god. That's when it hit me. If even something as simple as a mirror has a story this weird, how many of humanity's inventions are totally misunderstood? Who really came up with the wheel? What about ancient Greeks making steam engines left and right? And have you heard of Roman nanoengineering? Time to break down our biggest misconceptions on ancient technology. When you think of humanity's greatest invention, you probably picture the wheel, the Mesopotamian kings, mighty chariots, soldiers thundering into battle, the wheel carrying them all to glory in battles and so on. Or maybe you imagine ancient Egyptian builders moving giant stone blocks with wooden rollers to make their shiny new pyramids and temples. Because of course the first forms of the wheel was invented for something epic, right? Well, that was quite a bit later. It turns out that the very first wheel we know came from a mine somewhere in what is now Slovenia. Archaeologists studying the ancient Baden culture's sites uncovered roughly 5,000-year-old sculptures of wheeled wagons that look surprisingly modern. And what strikes me the most is that these people were mostly farmers and herders who made tools, pottery, and whatnot. They weren't even remotely in the same league as the Sumerians in terms of city building, writing, or complex institutions. And although Baden culture left no grand monuments, its people out-engineered the best Egyptian builders by 1,000 years. The modern team of scientists reconstructed how exactly unnamed Baden miners invented the world's oldest wheel. And this wasn't some brilliant eureka moment where one genius did the thing. It was more like a long, clunky evolution. First, they put roundish logs under heavy sleds to roll them a little more easily, just like Egyptians did much later. But then someone had the idea to fix those logs to the sled itself, so they turned with it. And finally, after who knows how many generations of tinkering, those rolling logs became a true axle with round wooden wheels attached. That's it. The grand invention that supposedly drove civilization forward was born in the dark by tired miners just trying to move rocks without throwing out their backs. So next time you picture the wheel as some shining symbol of progress and glory, remember, it didn't come from the grandeur of Sumerian kings. It came from the mud, built by a culture history barely remembers, to do nothing more heroic than haul a few buckets of ore out of the ground. But once we really got the wheels spinning, we needed maps to find our way around, right? After all, what good is moving faster if you don't know where you're going? It seems obvious. Maps must have been invented to help travelers chart their routes, explorers trace new paths, and merchants connect distant cities. Surely, they started as practical tools for getting from point A to point B. But the truth is, the earliest maps had nothing to do with travel. They weren't even really maps in the way we understand them today. They were more like sacred diagrams, ritualistic drawings meant to please the gods, not guide the humans. The famous Babylonian Imago Mundi, carved in clay around 900 BCE, shows the world as a flat disk ringed by cosmic waters. It wasn't meant to get you anywhere, but to show your place in the divine scheme. Other examples from even earlier times depict star constellations, ceremonial grounds, or fields divided into geometric shapes to mark who owned what, useful if you were a priest, arguing about whose temple land was bigger, but not much good if you were trying to actually get to the next town. In ancient China, maps weren't all that practical too. Some of the oldest ones found in tombs show perfectly arranged fields and rivers, more like a vision of harmony than a way to get around. Even in Europe, Neolithic carvings thought to be maps of villages may just as easily have been ritual markers, not practical road guides. The idea of a map as something for an ordinary traveler, a way to actually go somewhere, didn't really take hold until much later, when trade routes and empires made long-distance travel common. Before that, maps were about claiming, praying, and impressing the heavens. So the next time you picture an ancient wanderer rolling up a map and heading out on a road trip, good luck using one of those to find anything in the real world. But then, once we figured out the compass, it became a game changer for any traveler. Salty sailors on creaking ships staring at the needle as it points north, guiding them through fog and storm toward distant shores. It seems obvious. The compass must have been invented for explorers and traders charting their way across the seas. At least, that's what you might think. And you're wrong yet again. The first compasses appeared in China more than 2,000 years ago, and they had nothing to do with travel. Ancient Chinese scholars discovered that naturally magnetized iron ore, lodestone, always turned to a consistent direction, and that incidentally was south, not north. But at the time, they didn't think about navigation at all. Instead, this was a sign from the heavens, a way to understand the hidden forces of the world. By the 2nd century BCE, Chinese priests and geomancers were already using lodestone spoons and plates as instruments in divination rituals and feng shui. They believed that aligning buildings, graves, and even entire cities with these cosmic directions would bring harmony, prosperity, and protection. Moreover, fortune tellers were stunned by the prospects of impressing clients with this divine device and instantly employed it to foretell the future. Let that sink in. Probably the most high-tech thing of the time was used to scam someone into thinking he or she would definitely get married this year. Simply amazing. It wasn't until much later, nearly 1,000 years on, that someone thought to bring the compass aboard a ship to find directions. By the 11th century CE, during China's Song dynasty, records describe sailors using floating magnetic needles on water to navigate in open seas, especially when the stars and sun were hidden by clouds. Within another century, it had become a common feature of Chinese maritime trade. Knowledge of this strange, reliable instrument spread westward, and by the 13th century, European sailors were using compasses too, finally making it into the tool of exploration we know today. Looking at the history of this invention, one could say humanity really needed some directions here. Still, Chinese people were the first to come up with even more transformative tech that changed wars forever. When you hear gunpowder, you probably picture battlefields, cannons roaring, muskets cracking, soldiers charging through smoke. But as it turns out, just like with the compass, the story of this invention really begins on a much stranger battlefield. Gunpowder was first created in China more than 1,000 years ago during the Tang Dynasty, sometime in the 9th century. Alchemists working in imperial laboratories were searching for something completely different, the legendary elixir of immortality. Instead, they stumbled onto a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that burned fast and loud, and occasionally blew up in their faces. This early black powder wasn't exactly what the emperor ordered, but still seemed impressive. And so, by the 10th century, Chinese scholars found a really good use for this invention. That is, scaring away evil spirits. They packed it into bamboo tubes, lit it, and sent it screaming into the sky. The brilliant flashes and deafening pops of these early fireworks were believed to frighten ghosts and demons who lurked around festivals and funerals. Court records from the Song Dynasty in the 11th century even describe elaborate firework displays staged to bless royal weddings and New Year celebrations. So, gunpowder became a favorite party trick of the time. Whole industries sprang up around crafting colorful rockets and spinning wheels, each one designed to impress audiences and keep the spirit world at bay. It seems really weird, but only like 100 years later, military engineers did begin to see gunpowder's lethal potential. By the 13th century, weapons like fire lances and early bombs started appearing on Chinese battlefields. And of course, over time, its fame and its firepower spread westward to the Middle East and Europe, forever reshaping warfare. But in the beginning, basically, humanity invented explosions to scare demons, impress the neighbors, and terrify grandma. But ancient inventions aren't all about humble origins and spiritual shenanigans. Some of them weren't just ahead of their time, they were ahead of ours. Running water, flush toilets, warm floors on a winter morning. We like to think of indoor plumbing and central heating as the height of modern comfort, the kind of luxuries that separate us from the past. But in reality, people cracked these so-called modern conveniences a couple millennia ago. Take the Indus Valley Civilization. Nearly 4,000 years in the past, the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were already equipped with something most of the world wouldn't see again for many centuries: private bathrooms. Archaeologists have uncovered entire city blocks lined with terracotta sewer pipes running beneath the streets. Many homes had their own small bathrooms with drains connected to these underground systems, neatly carrying waste and water away from the living quarters. And this wasn't some cobbled-together fix. These ancient engineers really did create a complex urban network that wouldn't look out of place in a modern city. And the Romans, they weren't about to settle for a cold marble floor. By the 1st century BCE, Roman architects had perfected the hypocaust, a system of raised floors and hollow walls that allowed hot air from a wood-fired furnace to circulate and warm entire rooms. Wealthy Romans even built public baths and villas where you could walk barefoot across heated tiles, while the walls themselves radiated gentle heat. For its time, it was an engineering marvel, and honestly, even today, most apartments don't come close. Your radiator at home probably has just 2 settings: full-on sauna or Arctic tundra. So, the next time you congratulate yourself for living in the age of modern comforts, remember, there were people enjoying hot floors, warm walls, and private bathrooms thousands of years before your building super figured out how to fix the heat. But at least we have cool refrigerators, pun intended, to keep our food fresh like no other culture did before us. I mean, many of them used ice and underground cells, but it's all pathetic and clunky compared to what we have with electricity. Well, the ancient Persians would like a word with you. Around 400 BCE, long before anyone dreamed of an outlet or a plug, engineers in what's now Iran were building massive structures called yakhchals, literally ice pits. At first glance, these looked like giant mud brick beehives rising out of the desert sand. But inside, they hid one of the cleverest cooling systems the world had ever seen. Each yakhchal was a huge domed chamber with thick, insulating walls made of a special mortar that resisted heat, moisture, and even the baking desert sun. At the bottom of the structure sat a deep pit where ice harvested from nearby mountains in the winter or frozen overnight in shallow ponds could be stored. But the real genius was in how they kept it frozen through the brutal summer months. Many yakhchals were built with underground tunnels that channeled cool air down into the pit, while hot air rose and escaped through vents at the top. Some were positioned to catch the prevailing winds, which passed over water channels and evaporated just enough to cool the incoming air even further. The walls themselves could be more than 2 meters thick, keeping the interior temperature astonishingly low even when it was scorching outside. Thanks to this system, ancient Persians could keep ice and imperishable food perfectly usable all summer long, right in the middle of the desert. Well, that's more than can be said for my freezer, which can't even prevent my ice cream from getting soft. But sometimes, the invention is so ahead of its time that it seems simply unreal. So, how about some steampunk robots from ancient Greece? I am not joking. Obviously, when you think of the steam engine, you picture the Industrial Revolution, factories roaring to life, locomotives chugging down endless tracks, and clouds of smoke rising over 19th century cities. But the steam engine was actually invented almost 2,000 years earlier. In the 1st century CE, an inventor named Heron of Alexandria created a device called the Aeolipile. At first glance, it looked like a simple hollow metal sphere mounted on a pair of pivots. But inside, Heron poured water and then heated it from below. As the water boiled, steam shot out of 2 bent nozzles on either side of the sphere, making it spin rapidly on its axis. That's right, it was a working steam-powered machine centuries before anyone even dreamed of industrialization. Heron himself wasn't trying to revolutionize labor. His ingenious little device was designed to entertain temple visitors. Heron rigged up a hidden system beneath the floor using weights, pulleys, and a sealed container of water. When a priest lit a fire on the altar, the heat warmed the air in the sealed vessel below. As the air expanded, it pushed water into another container, which in turn pulled a series of ropes and counterweights. Slowly, the ropes swung the great bronze doors open, just as if the gods themselves had answered the prayers. To the worshippers, it was nothing short of divine. In reality, it was physics and clever engineering. Why didn't it catch on as something more practical? Well, imagine if modern automatic doors took like 3 hours to open in front of you. You probably wouldn't want this tech to spread, right? But Heron didn't stop there. He also designed mechanical birds who sang on steam power. Modern engineers had a hard time recreating what this man did back then. But Heron's most impressive creations were programmable theater automata, or basically robotic performances. He designed entire puppet shows powered by a series of weights, pulleys, and ropes wound around drums. As the weights dropped, they would pull the ropes in a precise sequence, making the puppets move. Ships sail across tiny stages, even creating sound effects like thunder and applause. The sequence could even be programmed differently by rearranging the ropes and weights, letting him change the story performed. To the audience, it was pure magic, lifelike figures acting out a play all on their own. Ain't this enough for calling it ancient Greek steampunk? Sadly, Huron's inventions didn't catch on and were perceived just as obscure yet clever toys. You mean you want to try to substitute cheap and convenient slave labor with this? It would take nearly 2,000 years and a completely different set of priorities before humans finally realized what they could do with that kind of power. By now you might be thinking, okay, sure, ancient people had a few clever tricks, but at least we can all agree on this one. Nanotechnology is cutting edge. That's modern science, something we only unlocked in the last few decades with electron microscopes and particle physics. No way anyone was playing around with that one a half millennium ago, right? Say hello to the Lycurgus cup. This Roman glass masterpiece, created sometime in the 4th century CE, looks beautiful enough just sitting on a shelf, a richly decorated cup depicting the mythical King Lycurgus trapped in a tangle of vines. But here's where it gets strange. When you shine light on the cup from the front, it appears a shimmering jade green. But when light passes through it from behind, the entire cup glows a deep, vibrant red. For centuries, nobody really knew how it worked. The Romans certainly didn't leave an instruction manual. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists finally figured out the secret. Embedded in the glass are nanoparticles of gold and silver, dispersed at just the right size and concentration to manipulate light on a submicroscopic level. The particles are smaller than the wavelength of visible light itself, meaning they scatter and absorb photons in ways our eyes perceive as dramatic color shifts. What's even more astonishing is how precise the effect is, something modern materials engineers still marvel at today. Some people even want to think it's some piece of alien tech. But let's be real, it's more like a really lucky coincidence. Most probably, the Romans stumbled onto this effect by accident and perfected it through some trial and error without proper understanding what exactly creates it. Still, the result is undeniable. They managed to engineer a piece of nanotechnology centuries before anyone even knew atoms existed. And you thought your mood ring was impressive. And just when you think you've heard it all, shopping malls, that glittering temple of consumerism we like to blame on 20th century America, sprawling complexes full of stores, food courts, and people wandering around pretending to need another pair of shoes. Yep, you probably already guessed it. The Romans beat us to that one too. Around 110 CE, Emperor Trajan unveiled what is now known as Trajan's Market, a massive, multi-story complex right in the heart of Rome. Archaeologists count at least 150 individual rooms and storefronts built into the complex. It had rows of shops selling everything from olive oil to silks, little eateries tucked into corners, and a huge central hall where people gathered to browse, gossip, and spend a few coins on things they probably hadn't planned to buy. We like to think our inventions are about survival, mastering the world, pushing boundaries, making life better. But sometimes, one of the first things we invent for ages to come is just a place to shop.